The South Col sits at 26,000 feet above sea level, a windswept saddle of rock and ice pressed between Everest and Lhotse. The air here contains 1/3 the oxygen found at sea level. The ground is littered with spent oxygen canisters, torn fabric from old expeditions, and the occasional body of a climber who did not leave. Wind moves constantly across the kernel. The temperature on May 10, 1996, hovers near -50 degrees Celsius at altitude. This is the highest camp on the standard route to the summit of Mount Everest. Seaborn Beck Weathers was born in 1946 in Dallas, Texas. He trained as a pathologist. He married. He had 2 children. For much of his adult life, he later stated, he lived with depression. In 1986, at 40 years old, he took a mountaineering course. He discovered that physical exertion at altitude provided relief. When he pushed his body to exhaustion, he found he could not think. This absence of thought was, in his words, pleasant. He began climbing mountains. He set a goal to climb the 7 summits, the highest peak on each continent. Richard Bass, the first person to complete this objective, became an inspiration to Weathers. Bass made Everest seem achievable for what Weathers called regular people. Over the next decade, Weathers climbed mountains in various parts of the world. His wife, Peach, grew concerned. She warned him that his obsession with climbing was damaging their marriage and separating him from his family. Weathers heard her but did not change course. In May of 1996, Weathers joined an expedition led by Rob Hall, a well-regarded New Zealand guide. Hall's company, Adventure Consultants, was guiding 8 clients. Weathers was 49 years old. The expedition proceeded through the standard acclimatization process. They climbed to various camps, returned to base, and climbed again, allowing their bodies to adjust to the decreasing oxygen. A year and a half before the expedition, Weathers had undergone radial keratotomy surgery. The procedure involved making small incisions in the corneas to correct nearsightedness. He hoped it would solve the problem of fogged goggles and frozen contact lenses at high altitude. The surgery was relatively new. Neither Weathers nor his ophthalmologist knew that at extreme altitude, a cornea altered by radial keratotomy would flatten and thicken. This would shorten focal length and cause temporary blindness. On May 9, the team left for High Camp. They departed base camp and climbed all day, reaching the South Col in the late afternoon. 4 groups set up tents there that night. In addition to Hall's team, there was an expedition led by American guide Scott Fisher, a Taiwanese group, and a team from South Africa. Perhaps 30 climbers occupied the kernel. The plan was to rest for a few hours, then depart near midnight to reach the summit by midday on May 10. Weathers and the others left High Camp in darkness. They moved in single file, each climber using supplemental oxygen. The route ascended the southeast ridge. Progress was measured in steps followed by rest. Weathers was positioned 4th in the line of climbers. As dawn approached, he realized his vision was failing. The world in front of him blurred. He could not see the face of the mountain. He stepped out of the line and let the other climbers pass. He waited, hoping that when the sun rose fully, his pupils would constrict and his vision would sharpen through depth of field. He was now last in the group of 30 climbers. The sun rose. Weathers's vision improved somewhat. He was able to continue climbing. But then he wiped his face with a glove crusted in ice. A small ice crystal scratched his right cornea. That eye went completely blurred. With only one partially functional eye, he lost depth perception. He could not safely climb higher. He reached a ledge called the balcony, a small, relatively flat area approximately 1,500 feet below the summit. The elevation here was 27,000 feet. At 7:30 in the morning, Weathers told Rob Hall that he could not see well enough to continue. Hall gave him 30 minutes to see if his vision would clear. When it did not, Hall instructed Weathers to wait at the balcony. Hall would return from the summit and descend with him. Weathers sat down. Other climbers passed him on their way up. By noon, 3 climbers were descending from the summit. They invited Weathers to join them. He declined. He reasoned that if he left his position, Hall would not know whether Weathers had descended safely or had fallen. Weathers did not consider the possibility that Hall might not return. 3 o'clock passed. Then 4. Then 5. The light began to flatten. The temperature dropped. The wind increased. Weathers had been sitting or standing without significant movement for more than 10 hours. He was using supplemental oxygen, which prevented acute hypoxia, but the cold was beginning to act on his body and mind. He began to hallucinate. He saw people who were not there. Around 5:30 in the afternoon, guide Mike Groom appeared, descending with Yasuko Namba, a 47-year-old Japanese climber. Namba was exhausted to the point of near collapse. Several climbers from Scott Fisher's expedition arrived as well, including Neil Beidleman, Sandy Pittman, Charlotte Fox, and Tim Madsen. All had summit. All were near the limits of endurance. Beidleman took responsibility for Namba. Groom short-roped Weathers, tying one end of a rope around Weathers and holding the other end to provide stability as they descended. They were less than a quarter mile from high camp when the storm arrived. It began as a low sound, then rapidly formed into what survivors later described as a white fog mixed with ice pellets. Visibility dropped to near zero. Wind speeds exceeded 70 knots. The temperature fell toward -60 degrees. The group could not see their own feet. They lost all sense of direction. The climbers moved together in a tight group, attempting to feel the slope of the ground, searching for any landmark. Then Beidleman stopped. He sensed something wrong. He shouted that they needed to halt. The group was approximately 25 feet from the edge of the Kangshung face, a 7,000-foot vertical drop. A few more steps and they would have slid off the mountain. The climbers sat down in the storm. They huddled together for warmth. After discussion, the strongest members of the group, including Beidleman, guide Clef Schoening, and Mike Groom, decided to make a high-speed attempt to find camp and bring back help. If they failed to locate the tents, no rescue would be possible. Beidleman, Schoening, and Groom found high camp. They were on their hands and knees when they arrived. They could not go back out into the storm. No one else in camp was in condition to attempt a rescue in those conditions, with one exception. Anatoly Bukrev was a Russian guide working for Scott Fisher's expedition. Bukrev went out into the storm 3 times. He was searching for Fisher, who was higher on the mountain and would later freeze to death approximately 1,200 feet above the South Col. Bukrev also searched for the stranded group. On his 3rd attempt, he located the huddle by the Kangshung face. He brought back 3 climbers from Fisher's team, Tim Madsen, Charlotte Fox, and Sandy Pittman. He left Yasuko Namba and Beck Weathers behind. The storm was too severe. He could not carry them. The storm diminished on the morning of May 11th. The wind dropped to approximately 30 knots. Stuart Hutchison and 3 Sherpas went out to search for Namba and Weathers. They found the 2 climbers lying next to each other, largely buried in snow and ice. Hutchison approached Namba first. He pulled her up by her coat. A 3-inch layer of ice covered her face. He peeled it back. Her skin looked like porcelain. Her eyes were dilated. But she was breathing, faintly. He moved to Weathers. He pulled him upright and cleared the ice from his face and beard. Weathers was also barely alive. His skin had the same porcelain appearance. He was breathing, but minimally. Hutchison faced a decision. Both climbers appeared to be dying. Any attempt to move them would endanger the Sherpas and himself. The altitude, the cold, and the residual wind made a rescue nearly impossible. Hutchison and the Sherpas returned to high camp. They reported that Namba and Weathers were dead. Hutchison radioed down to base camp. Base camp contacted Hall's office in Christchurch, New Zealand. The office relayed the information to Dallas. On the morning of May 11th, the phone rang in the Weathers home. Peach Weathers answered. She was told by the office manager that her husband had been killed descending from the summit. Peach asked if there was any hope. The office manager said no. There had been a positive identification of the body. On the South Col, Beck Weathers regained consciousness. The timeline is uncertain. Survivors reported that he was left in the storm for approximately 15 hours total. When he opened his eyes, he did not immediately know where he was. He later described believing, briefly, that he was at home in Texas. Then he became aware of the cold and the altitude. In what he described as an epiphany, he saw his family clearly in his mind. He stood up. His right arm was frozen solid from the elbow down. His left hand was frozen. His face was frozen. He could barely see. He began walking in the direction he believed camp to be. Climbers at high camp saw a figure approaching through the snow. They could not identify who it was. When Weathers stumbled into camp, they radioed base camp. The response was disbelief. The message relayed back was that this was interesting, but it changed nothing. Weathers was going to die. He should not be brought down the mountain. Weathers was placed in Scott Fisher's tent. Most climbers prepared to break camp at dawn. They packed quietly, attempting not to wake him. Only a few people remained: John Krakauer, a journalist on Hall's expedition, and guides Todd Burleson and Pete Athens, who were leading a separate expedition. Weathers called out from the tent. Krakauer heard him. When Krakauer looked inside and saw that Weathers was conscious and speaking, his jaw dropped. Weathers was supposed to be dead. Base camp was informed that Weathers was alive but critically injured. The conventional understanding of high-altitude hypothermia suggested that Weathers had only delayed the inevitable. His core temperature had dropped so low that full recovery was not expected. Peach Weathers received a second phone call. She was told that her husband was not dead, but he was in critical condition. The message was cautious, designed not to create false hope. Peach heard only that he was alive. She immediately began organizing. She contacted friends in Dallas. She reached out to Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison and Senate Minority Leader Tom Dashley. They contacted the State Department. The State Department reached a young man named David Skinstead at the U.S. Embassy in Kathmandu. Skinstead worked with a Nepalese woman named Inu Khatri Chetri. The initials KC indicated membership in a warrior caste. This carried specific cultural obligations regarding honor and courage. Inu Khatri Chetri knew a helicopter pilot. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Madan Khatri Chetri, also KC. He was 42 years old. Several pilots had already declined to attempt the rescue. The helicopter's rated ceiling was below the altitude of the South Col. The air was too thin. The machine would likely fall out of the sky. Inu told Skinstead she knew a man who had never been sufficiently challenged to test whether his courage was real. She contacted Madan. He was playing golf at the Royal Nepal Golf Club, on the second shot of the first hole. When the message reached him, he did not decline. He said he would do it. Inu told Skinstead she knew a man who had never been sufficiently challenged to test whether his courage was real. She contacted Madan. He was playing golf at the Royal Nepal Golf Club, on the second shot of the first hole. When the message reached him, he did not decline. He said he would do it. Madan flew a Eurocopter Squirrel, an American-made helicopter belonging to the Royal Nepalese Army. On the morning of May 12, he flew to the South Col. The air at 26,000 feet was unstable. The helicopter struggled. But Madan was able to hover briefly. Weathers and another critically injured climber, Makalu Gao of Taiwan, were loaded into the aircraft. Madan descended. He flew them to a lower camp, then to Kathmandu. At the time, this was the highest altitude helicopter rescue ever performed on Mount Everest. Weathers was transported to a clinic in Kathmandu. His hands were cold and gray. The tissue looked like meat left too long in a freezer. There was no swelling, no blistering. Weathers had seen frostbite before. He had experienced minor frostbite on Denali. That injury had been painful. This time there was no pain. He did not yet understand the severity of the damage. He was flown to Dallas. He met with a hand surgeon named Mike Doyle. Doyle examined him and asked him to spread his fingers, make a fist, and cross his fingers. Weathers was able to do all of these things. Doyle told him he would probably lose most of the fingers on his right hand and the tips of the fingers on his left. Later that day, Doyle called Weathers. His voice indicated distress. He told Weathers that a scan revealed no blood supply in the right hand. The blood flow stopped above the wrist. The left hand had very little circulation. Weathers's hands were essentially dead. The tendons that controlled the fingers extended into his forearms, which allowed him to move the fingers temporarily, but the hands themselves had no viable tissue. A reconstructive plastic surgeon, Greg Anijan, was brought in to attempt to save whatever function remained in the left hand. The right arm was amputated halfway between the elbow and wrist. All four fingers and the thumb of the left hand were amputated. Parts of both feet were removed. Weathers's nose had been frozen deep into the cartilage and bone. Before the necrotic tissue was removed, surgeons made an impression of the original nose using a piece of chewing gum wrapper. This would serve as a template. Surgeons then cut a nose-shaped section of skin from the center of Weathers's forehead. Using cartilage from his ears and skin from his neck, they constructed a new nose and grew it upside down on his forehead while the blood supply established. After several weeks, the new nose was rotated down into position. Weathers also lost his right eyebrow and his right big toe. The eyebrow fell off in his hand one day while he was sitting in a chair. The toe detached and skittered down a hallway. Peach Weathers had told Beck, on the first evening he returned home, that the years of climbing had driven her and their children away. She told him she would stay with him for 1 year. If he was a genuinely different person at the end of that year, they would discuss the future of their marriage. Weathers later stated that he dedicated himself fully to that objective. He applied the same drive and obsession he had previously directed toward mountains to repairing his relationships. At the end of the year, Peach agreed to continue the marriage. The old relationship was gone, she later said, but something new had begun to form. Weathers returned to his work as a pathologist. He wrote a book about his experience, titled Left for Dead, My Journey Home from Everest. He delivered motivational speeches. He continued to live in Dallas. When asked if he would climb Everest again, knowing everything that would happen, Weathers said yes. He stated that on the mountain he traded his hands for his family and for his future. He considered it a bargain he readily accepted. 8 climbers died on Everest on May 10 and 11, 1996. It was the deadliest event on the mountain in 75 years. Rob Hall, the expedition leader who told Weathers to wait at the balcony, died high on the mountain while assisting another client. Scott Fisher, the American guide, froze to death above the South Col. Yasuko Namba, who had been left beside Weathers in the storm, died at high camp after being brought back by rescuers. Beck Weathers was left for dead twice. He was buried in ice and snow for approximately 15 hours at an altitude where the human body is actively dying. The precise mechanism by which he regained consciousness remains uncertain. Doctors later described his survival as improbable. His hands, when they were examined during surgery, were described as the hands of a dead man. The storm that struck the mountain on May 10 arrived with little warning. Meteorological analysis later suggested that a sudden drop in barometric pressure contributed to the rapid deterioration of conditions. Wind speeds exceeded 70 knots. Visibility dropped to near zero. The temperature at altitude fell below -60 degrees. Climbers who were strong and healthy hours earlier became disoriented and hypothermic within minutes. Weathers stated in interviews that he had spent most of his adult life in profound depression. He had not told anyone. He discovered that if he drove his body hard enough, he could not think, and that absence of thought was pleasant. Climbing became the method by which he avoided confronting the interior of his life. His wife recognized this. His children recognized this. Weathers recognized this only after Everest. He later said that for the first time in his life, he had peace. He no longer sought to define himself through external achievements. He was comfortable, he said, inside his own skin. He had searched the world for fulfillment and found it, eventually, in his own home. The South Col remains littered with the remnants of expeditions. Tents are torn apart by wind. Oxygen canisters lie half buried in snow. The wind moves constantly across the kernel. The temperature rarely rises above -30 degrees Celsius. Climbers still pass through on their way to the summit. Some of them sit at the same spot where Beck Weathers sat on May 10, 1996, waiting for a guide who would not return. The mountain does not record intention or effort. It records only outcome. Weathers descended from 26,000 feet with no blood flow to his hands and minimal blood flow to his feet. He walked on frozen feet. He was guided by other climbers who were themselves near collapse. He survived a night alone in a tent, unable to eat or drink or cover himself. He was helicoptered off the mountain in an aircraft flying above its rated ceiling, piloted by a man who accepted a challenge because his culture defined honor in a specific way. All of these events are documented. The timeline is established. The names are recorded. The outcome is known. Beck Weathers lost his right arm below the elbow, his left hand, parts of both feet, and his nose. He returned to his family. He returned to his work. He lived.